Chris Niebauer, welcome back to NEOHUMAN Podcast, this time the 95th episode.
Hey, so great to be here. First, let me start off. Thank you so much for a copy of the book.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
really awesome. I think you really need to have in paperback. It feels good. The art is amazing. So it was so cool to be part of that.
I
I
really
really
appreciate
enjoyed
it.
it.
Yeah, Chris was nice enough to write a foreword for my first book, which is a poetry book. And I also work with a great Japanese artist, Takamoto Mamiko. So yeah, I appreciate you promoting the book. Let me promote your book. Chris Niebauer's book that basically brought us together, No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. And I remember you were saying that you're working also on a new book, right?
It's a collection of exercises, because one of the things from the first book people realize is like you can't think your way out of a thinking problem. So I don't want to just take a bunch of thoughts and philosophy and expect that to really transform people. So we switch things around. It's just exercise after exercise. Some of them seem silly almost to the thinking mind, but they're all trying to get us out of the or I don't want to say get us out of the thinking mind, but put the thinking mind in its proper place. It's a useful tool. We wouldn't want to get rid of it. It helps me remember where I left my keys. It helps me solve problems, but you probably only need it maybe a couple hours a day at best. And the problem is most people, they don't have an off switch. So they're sleeping, trying to get to sleep. And unfortunately, that program's still going. And so this one, so not only does it focus on the exercises, but it takes us a little further back. What was the origins of mind? Did it just turn on 200 years ago? And I started doing some really deep work in anthropology and discovered some very fascinating things about our species. And so it takes us all the way back 2 million years ago when human beings showed up on the scene. And then it takes us through when Homo sapiens showed up. And a lot of the theory is around what happened to us as Homo sapiens. So a lot of us don't realize that there were 8 different types of humans on the planet. And that was really just up until like Homo erectus was on the planet for 2 million years. Homo sapiens, we just came along like 200,000 years ago. So we just got here. And then this wild thing happened where we just dominated, completely took over the whole planet, exterminated, possibly, except there's other theories, but we may have just exterminated all the different forms of humanity.
Right.
And now we're left.
Yeah.
And so, the theory tries to suggest that the reason we were so successful is because the way the mind works. And the mind was good at strategizing. It's good at categorization. Some of the stuff I'm sure we'll talk about today. But those were all super advantages in terms of our species. These other, like Homo erectus, may have been able to think and reason a little bit, but they didn't have the tools that we had in terms of creating groups, in-group and out-groups. And so even though we were physically smaller, say than Neanderthal, but it didn't matter, because if you get 10 of us working together as a group, we'll still be able to take out that one much larger individual. And so it tries to give people a backstory on this thinking mind. Where did it come from? Why is it so hard to turn off? And it's trying to solve problems that we had 100,000 years ago. So it's dealing with glaciers and food supply and extreme changes in temperature. And now all of a sudden we're in a place where we created a world that has almost no temperature change at all with air conditioning and heat. Many of us live between 68 and 72 degrees or something. And so what does the mind have to do?
Yeah.
What does it have to do? And so what it does is it still finds its meaning in finding problems. So it is out there. When it can't find a problem, it creates one. In fact, I'll send you another link. It's maybe one of the most important papers. I don't know if you've seen it or maybe we've talked about it, but it demonstrated this so beautifully, experimentally, that the mind is just creating problems. And it will redefine what a problem is if its first problem changes. Or say you solve the first problem. It will redefine the problem so it continuously has something to do. And so they gave subjects a task. Just hit a key every time a blue dot comes up. And it was blue dots, and they would go all the way from blue to purple. And eventually they just stopped showing blue dots. And you'd think, well, the subject should just stop responding. Here's my target. It's not there anymore. I stopped responding, but they didn't. They changed the definition of blue. So they started responding to purple dots. And that's kind of cool. But the next two studies, really, it's worth just giving you a short description of, because it's going to be relevant to, I think, our whole discussion. But in another study, what they had is bright faces that look threatening. So they had a really threatening face, but then it really went all the way to like a neutral or maybe completely non-threatening face. But the first task was hit a key every time you see this particular threatening face. And then just like before, they stopped showing threatening faces. And again, people didn't stop responding. They just changed what a threatening face is. So suddenly this face that was neutral, now they think that that's a threat. And the last one, I think, again, maybe that was the most relevant one to some of the stuff we're dealing with. They said, so you're going to be a researcher and you're evaluating the ethics on this research proposal. And they would throw in huge ethical flaws. And your task is to catch the ethical flaw. And so, of course, everyone was pretty good at this. Then they removed the ethical flaws. And again, instead of not responding anymore, like, hey, problem solved, people changed the definition of what an ethical problem is. Right. So they would continuously, and here's the most beautiful part about this study. They went and told people, like, look, we're going to stop the problem. We're going to stop showing you the target. Had no effect. Then they paid people to be correct. So you think, look, I'm going to get paid if I'm just accurate. Had no effect on performance. It's so set on redefining what a problem is that, and I think that's one of the things we're dealing with right now. So many of our problems that our mind, the thinking mind, evolved to solve, that they're gone. So now we find like, whoa, it's 68 degrees, I'm freezing, and that becomes a problem. Or it's 74 or 75, and I'm too hot. So all these things that we're dealing with in society, these amazing complaints that we're just like, where did that stuff come from? So many things in office politics. I mean, so much of the conflict that's going on right now, you could almost say, how much of the conflict going on is just people finding problems, because that seems to be what the mind does, and it does so even when there isn't a problem to be solved.
So this mentality of oppressed versus the oppressor, that Marxism kind of capitalized on it, by not creating it maybe, but by recognizing that this is something that is deeply embedded within humanity. And now it's been incentivized that, now it's changing a little bit, because I think people have begun seeing right through it. But for a long time, it was incentivized that if you're a victim, you're the special one. And so, for example, let's say within this context of critical race theory that we're going to talk about, all it is that if you're white, you are taking advantage of this privilege that has been given to you by other white people, who, by the way, screwed over everyone else for you as a white person to have this privilege. So if you're born white, not only you cannot not be an oppressor, you can't also recognize that, yes, I could have some privileges, but I don't really see races. I see just different people with... No. You can't be doing that either. You have to be actively anti-racist. And they define what is anti-racism, which includes, you buying books, a bunch of people who are getting paid like $20,000, $25,000 an hour just to give Zoom talks, just so people feel like, we're on the part of the oppressed. So
it's a beautiful Freudian trick. Freud did the same thing. He said, look, you hate your parents and it's unconscious, and one or two things happened. You'd either agree with them, say, you're right, I hate my parents, or you wouldn't, and then he's still right because it's just unconscious.
Right.
And there's no way the person can win. So anything you do, it's like it philosophically puts you into a corner where you can't win.
Yeah.
So you either admit that you're the oppressor, or by definition, you're like, you don't see it as a problem. Well,
you don't see it that you're an oppressor, but you're still an oppressor. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's an impossible. There's literally nothing. And again, maybe this has been one of the hallmarks of history. We put people into certain categories based on physical characteristics, and we back them into these corners. where there's really nothing they can do, except admit that this group is right. I mean, it ends up being their only choice.
Yeah, but obviously it's bogus in the context of, for example, critical race theory, because what it is that it's a form of racism that justifies itself because it's fighting a different kind of racism. But they're saying that this is actually not racism to be racist against white people, because white people have been in power for a very long time, so it's okay if they get screwed over for the sake of other people. But you see that even that, they're not staying true to that, because for Kanye West came out to support Trump. Everybody came down at him that, oh, he's white supremacist. He's a wrong kind of black. There are plenty of black people who are on the right, who are not going along with what's going on. A very good example is what happened yesterday in Virginia. That, a bunch of people on MSNBC and CNN were talking about, oh, this is a result of racism, that people have voted for this conservative, for the Republican Party by margin of a lot, because Biden won Virginia by, I think, around 10 points. And this shift has been enormous. But they're not even mentioning that Virginia also elected their first black female lieutenant governor. And, how is this going to be aligned with this idea that they're promoting, that no, all the white people are against all the black people, and all the black people are basically the oppressed, who have absolutely no ability to do anything other than just, being in this line that we're drawing with the leadership of absolute minority of people, most of whom are coming from academia, right? All this academic theory that they've forced upon people as some kind of social experiments, that they're saying, hey, just believe what we are saying. It's a new form of religion. Just believe in the greater good, the good end, the utopia that we are drawing, and everything else basically justifies this end.
And there's couple things going on there. I think cognitive science offers actually some help in this area, because we know cognitive or confirmation bias is probably one of the biggest faults of the way we think. We set out to prove we're right. And of course, that's what Freud did. And if you're really good at proving you're right, that's when you're clever enough to back people into a corner and they can't do anything. And so, again, when you just think about, like, what do you type? What are you typing? What are you looking at? And of course, there's algorithms that if you're only looking to confirm what you already know, then a computer is going to help you so much with that. All these search engines are going to they're going to so support this, because then you're just going to find more and more evidence of exactly what you know. And of course, if that's happening with the media, that's a problem too. But we also have really smart people like Steven Pinker goes around. I mean, he wrote that book Enlightenment Now to show that we really have it amazingly good right now. But I also love one of his other lines that almost seemed like it took me back to third grade, but we need a reminder of it. And he said, you cannot make accurate judgments about the individual based on their group membership. And it's like, well, yeah, I know that. we all seem like we should know that. But somehow we threw that philosophy we threw that piece of advice, or I would say that piece of fact, we just threw it out the window. And now we're back to saying, if I know your group membership, I know something about you. But the problem is, we know from research and statistics, no, you cannot make, that's the whole thing about when you look at the normal curve, it shows that here's a bunch of average people, but half of them will be on the right, and they're on the other. That's just an abstract way of describing a group. And there's tons of variability within that group. And what we're finding out, I think one of the major lessons that we will eventually find out, although I think maybe Jordan Peterson may have said this too already, that what we're going to find out is that there's far more variability within these groups than there are between them. And so simply by categorizing people white and black, well, what if there's more variability within each of those groups? And then it makes absolutely no sense to use the categorical division in the first place. And we need to move on to something that, unfortunately, is more complex. The thinking mind does not want to work. It's lazy. It loves cartoon-like versions of reality that are just easy to assimilate. And so when we tell people things like, well, here's group A and group B, and they have these different characteristics. Oh, you know someone from group B? Well, then this is one thing you can conclude about them. It's really a cartoon-like version of reality, but the mind buys into it because it loves simple stories like that. simple narratives, and we become victims of like just falling prey to just really simple stories that the mind is very. I mean, that's the way it worked. I mean, so the theory that I've been working on is, again, a story about our history as a species, and how is it that human beings came on the planet about 2.5 million years ago, and then all of a sudden we had all kinds of different, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and we had all these different, maybe 8, although they'll probably end up going to get to like 12. Who knows how many? They keep finding different versions when they find artifacts, but
of humans.
And these are human beings. These are human beings. But we have, slight differences. And again, Homo sapiens, our version, popped up on the scene only 200,000 years ago. And we were smaller. We were not physically dominant. But we had this gift, this kind of mental trick, this kind of mind hack of categorizing. And it's not that other species couldn't do this, but I think we just did it so effortlessly. It just came so easy. And one of the things that I think we're going to realize is that categorization is absolutely an illusion. It's the same. Like when people ask me, like, what do you mean by Maya? This illusory veil that prevents us from seeing the real world. And the thing I would point to is categorization. And categorization, again, what do we do with categorization? We take a bunch of individual differences, tons of variability. That's the way nature is. It's all messy. And then the mind will focus on one quality that all these very different things have in common, ignores everything else, ignores all the differences, the vast differences in all these individuals. And so we could say, like, that's ignorance. It's like ignorance. You just have to completely ignore all that. But they say, well, they all have this one thing in common. And again, whether it's skin color, gender, that's whatever of identity politics. You're taking people who have one thing in common and you're grouping them and then believing that it's possible to know that group. And you can't. I mean, there are a bunch of individuals who vary all over the place. It's super. And what it is, these averages that we talk about when we look at groups, they're statistical averages that are just. They exist in the world of abstractions. They're not, you can't go out and see these groups. Like you might be saying, well, I can see an example of a white person. Well, can you really see whiteness? Can you see, the race? And you can't because it's just, it's something that we've made up. And I think we're going to eventually start feeling that a little bit more deep. And you can see that some of the political stuff we're dealing with here is a argument between group identities, and I think identity politics is exactly that. It's simplifying people based on very trivial characteristics and race and gender. And the irony of this is that when you get into spiritual practices like a lot of different forms of meditation, that you start the meditation off saying, "I'm not my body." And so, I mean, you're starting off like with this acknowledgement, like my true self has nothing to do with this physical body. And so, and yet we seem to take some of these really trivial qualities and we categorize them and then believe we can know something about a person based on that. And
yeah, but even the term "we," when you say "we," there is no such a thing as "we."
No, there isn't. It's all useful, somewhat useful abstractions, but I think they are getting us into trouble more than they should. You're right.
Yeah. we all use it. Again, see, I'm saying we all use it. I'm sure there are some people who don't use it, but it also shows the limits of language and how limited everything man-made is towards that objective reality. And I think this is a very important difference to understand, that yes, the conflict of humanity seemed to have been around this dilemma of individuality and group, tribes basically. And for the longest time, it obviously made sense for people to be in groups because there were other groups of people, and if you were not in a group, you would be just decimated. You would be annihilated by that group of people. But we became more secure in the case of our survival. We are not bound to go and find any kind of a food today because there might not be food for the next 5 days. right? So we have the option to go to different grocery stores to find different items up to our likings, which is customized. So can let's say that shopper be placed in a group? Yes, it can be placed in a group of shoppers, people who go out and shop. But you cannot pin it down that there's a group of people who go, this percentage to like Publix, this percentage to Walgreens, this percentage to Walmart. People have this freedom and autonomy to make different choices, right? But it seems like because this structure called society is also man-made, this is not an objective reality. We have assembled this construct and all the tools within it, including ethics and morality, to get from point A to point B. And that point B has always been determined based on the need that we've had in order to survive. I don't think people have come together in most of history to build something necessarily. They've come together to build something against something or someone else. There's always been a threat for people to come together and build like I would argue it's always been about tools. You just build a more capable, more complex, more sophisticated tool, own the other group, and then the other group, whatever remains of it, notice what you've done, improve upon that tool. And, we have evolved in the way that our tools have surpassed our level of comprehension. And now we are really addressing the core of exactly what is it that when we say what do we mean? What are the elements that we have in, we share as a collective of humanity? And I think this is that point, which is the point of philosophy, really.
Yeah, I think we talked about the beginning of that movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, yes, where, that moment, that first thought, and one of our ancestors like, well, this is a bone, but I can use it as a weapon. So we started thinking in ways that we could use things for what they're not. And then he throws that bone into space and it becomes, a space shuttle or something. And you're like, wow, it's the same. The trick is like, it's the same thing that we were thinking 70,000 years ago that's responsible for all the technology that we have now. And it's all tool building, and it's, and it's not a linear scale, so we were building tools, and we, if you look at some, I think it was Homo erectus, just never accelerated with tools. They really had the same tools for like 2 million years. They had really simple things to cut with, and they never had that kind of, I need a better mousetrap kind of thing. And then we, of course, did. And so that's why you see this, this nice line where it just keeps going. But then all of a sudden, all the stuff we're making now, and if you look, like the basic production, like when did human production? And of course, you've got like the Industrial Revolution, but it's the curve just goes like this for the entire of humanity. And then all of a sudden, just like in the last 100 years, it goes up like this.
Yeah, because technology advances exponentially. And that line that seemed flat, it was never flat. You're showing a link on your screen. Oh, something came out. Interesting. Oh, you send me a link? Very interesting. I'll never see that. I just showed it now. Weird. Oh. Anyways, we're going to show some of Chris's articles about Chris's and all that. But that line that seemed flat, it was never flat. It's just the difference between each generation was, you go from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16. So it's not really, visible. But at some point, you go 30 steps exponentially, you hit billion, but our experience is linear. So yes, we have assumed that we're using all these tools, including radio and television and newspapers and, early internet and all that, in order to pursue our, what we assume to be shared goals, right? Because when you had limited sources of interpretation and distribution of information, obviously your objectives seem to be shared among the public because the options were not presented. But now for people who are willing to see, because it's terrifying, but it's also exciting, exhilarating. Somebody said on this podcast, that's the correct term to use for how we feel in this period. That, the tools have surpassed our evolution, and so all of our values are open to be questioned and open to be debated and challenged. And exactly because of that, I think some people are going back to very pure tribalism based on values and cultures and religions and whatever that they can hold on to. You know, I made this argument, I think 2 years ago on this podcast, that I think fundamentalist version of religions are going to make a comeback, because when everything seems so uncertain, you want to hold on to whatever that you can find that give you sense, illusion of certainty and solidity. And then there are a group of people who just want to stop all these technological advancement, or like, we have to put a moratorium on it and we don't need this level of advancement. And you know, the only thing I can tell those people is that good luck with that, because our evolution has never been separated from the evolution of tools and technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that if you take someone just right now and you take them into a lab and you get them to start making primitive tools, it's interesting that the left side of the brain starts like acting up, even though they're using, they can use their left hand, so that would activate normally, you think, the right side. But any kind of tool making, it just is such a primitive thing, and there's just programs in there that are set for making these really simple things. And of course, that's the same thing that goes into making computers. I mean, we're tapping into the same element of desire, and it's almost like that Buddhist thing, like, but desire is the cause of suffering, because it's our desire for whatever the next best thing is that used to be, and you're right, it's not flat, but it's nowhere near the curve that we're dealing with now. And so things become, kind of an existential, every phone goes by too quick, and you can probably upgrade your phone every year, and it's maybe every 6 months. And computers are just moving along just way too quickly for everybody. So we've got this, again, 70,000-year-old program that's living at a pace that it was never intended to. So I think you're right. People go back to fundamentalism because the core of fundamentalism, however it appears, is the absolute certitude in it. And that simplifies everything. It just makes everything else just seem, it's a set of rules. It's like a bureaucracy that if you follow all these rules, you have guaranteed outcomes. And so I would have to agree with you. I think that dogma, and we know what is dogma, but the inability to shutting down a question before it even comes up. And that's what we see so often. It's a frightening thing when you get into academia and the cancel culture, and you see people, stopping a debate before it even happens. And I would suggest to anyone listening, really get into James Lindsay on this. He's done an outstanding job of breaking down where all this came from, the history of it, and just reading simple books to you, like Marcuse, where he'll just start off and it so clearly that says that, look, if you're on the left, absolutely everything is tolerated. Violence, it's spelled out, but anything from the right has to be stopped before it even is thought. So you stop it before you don't wait till someone talks and then censor it. You have to stop it before they even have that thought.
Oh, you can't even, if you're coming from the left, you're not even allowed to share a platform that is given to somebody who you would recognize or categorize as right-wing. So, earlier on, I had some guests on this podcast, this is like 6 years ago, who would associate with the left. These are like prominent leftists now. And they had problems with some of the guests that I had later on. Like, you have to remove our episodes. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to do that. It really is a nonsensical problem that you do. I didn't give you any guarantee that I'm going to ask you who I'm going to talk to. But they're like, you're giving this argument that is toxic to our cause air, basically. You're giving it oxygen, and we're against that. Totally totalitarian.
But yeah, and if you say, well, one group gets to do whatever, free reign total, and the other group gets to be shut down, then that's interesting. Then you say, okay, well, how do you know someone's on the right? Because one of the fascinating things that happens to me as a university professor is, like, I wouldn't categorize myself as being on the left or the right. I would say I'm a complex person. My views, I don't even buy much into the solid reality of a self to begin with. So, I would say it's a fluid thing with different thoughts, and but my perception is that I'm very far on the right, and so when I go into the university, it's just assumed. And it's interesting too, because I get labeled being on the right specifically because I'm such an advocate for viewpoint diversity and wanting to get discussions going, and I want people to talk and debate, and I often quote John Stuart Mill and say, look, you don't even know your own argument unless you know the other side of it. And that gets me, all of a sudden I got this giant conservative label on me,
right?
And so it's freaking me out, because I'm like, so that's it's not even I'm like, well, that's conservative now.
Well, I'll tell you this. The African American Museum of, National Museum of African American History and Culture, they came out with something. Those of our viewers and listeners who watch this on YouTube, I'm showing these screenshots. They came out with whiteness and white culture. This was like a year and a half ago, I think, around the George Floyd whole thing, that they point out some of the characteristic and signs and elements of this white culture and whiteness. Rugged individualism, emphasis on scientific method, which includes objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationship, quantitative emphasis. But it also goes all the way to justice based on English common law. That is whiteness, therefore it's bad. Competition, being number one, win at all costs, winner-loser dichotomy. Action orientation, master and controlled nature, decision-making, majority rules. So obviously there was a huge backlash against these people, and they removed it from their website. Yet, if you go to their website right now, they have the talking about race section, they have a whiteness section. They go all the way down, explaining it and stuff. And then the video at the end of persons talking about it is this vile, racist woman, Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, that, it's not even like hidden or subtle. It's that this is how it is. We are being racist against white people, and that is acceptable because white people have been in power. And I echo what you said about James Lindsay. Lindsay was a guest here almost a year and a half ago on this podcast. And it was really interesting because when we did the episode, few days after that, George Floyd stuff happened. And he was like, I'm just going to release this a little later. I was like, yeah, man, totally. But, I also had an interesting experience. I went to see the first manned launch of a SpaceX rocket. It was a test Dragon with the very first astronauts they sent to International Space Station. And it was the same day that they were burning down number of communities all around the U.S. I think it was May 31st, 2020. And I was thinking how America has a choice, such a clear choice, that you have a building culture. I went to see the launch and all that. It's like 3 hours drive from here. You have the building culture of building a rocket, a reusable rocket that send astronauts to the space station and then come back. It's just incredible achievement. And on the other hand, you have this cancel culture, which is a destructive culture of basically we just want to remove everything that exists as a result of this white culture or white supremacy or whatever, and we don't know what we're going to replace it with, but we do need that. A good thing to do is to removing all of them, and people shouldn't put up with it for any amount of ethical and moral argument, because it is immoral and unethical to begin with, that we're going to ruin the lives of a whole bunch of people because of the color of their skin, because we have this abstract ideal utopia that we might or might not get to it. But so no, there is no ethical or moral argument whatsoever.
And people have to be really careful, because I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with the Jane Elliott experiments, when she took these third graders and just said, well, people with brown eyes are smarter than people with blue eyes, and they all just sucked right up into it. I mean, they just bought into it, and they were treating people horribly. And then she just went in the next day and reversed it and said, no, it's actually, whatever other eye colors. And she switched it on them. and they just followed right along. I mean, so that's that old program. It's so susceptible to, if we hear this category and then we say, well, this category equals bad, we have to actually become extremely conscious of how susceptible we are to that for us to actually ever be able to overcome it. Sorry, I think I lost you for a second.
No, I'm here. I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I remember my daughter, she came home from school maybe it was around third grade, and she was all confused, and she looked and she goes, "Dad, am I white?" You know, like it was never like an obvious kind of thing to her. And so I like held up some like typing paper next to her skin. I'm like, "Do you look white? What do you think?" And she just kind of looked at me. She goes, "Well, I'm you know," and I was like, a white person would be kind of terrifying, right? I mean, it's like if they were like the definition of white. And so it just shows you these are cartoon caricatures that we're dealing with. It's so absolutely obvious that they are things that are only existing in our head. I mean, think about race. I mean, where is it when no one's thinking about it? And where is it? Like, there's so many places you can go. One of the reasons in fact, I was just down close to you, I think, in St. Petersburg a couple of months ago, and you can go to beaches and all this. And one of the reasons I love it is because you see such variation in skin color, and just no one doesn't. I mean, it's not recognized.
Yeah.
We're all just human beings hanging out at the beach, and so. But then you watch certain news channels, and it looks like there's this, you know, it's like it's a war going on, and so much of that is just covered by the media, and then the susceptibility of the mind to just fall prey to these simple categories. I mean, and we have to be very careful what we expose kids to too, because I think that Jane Elliott was such a good, you know, none of that would have been ethical these days to do something like that to these kids, but it just showed so explicitly our susceptibility to thinking in simplistic categories and then doing really nasty stuff to people if they're in the out group. And you'd think we would have learned that lesson. And so anytime you refer to any category, well, you know, whiteness or white anything, or again, like I said with Steven Pinker, you cannot make reliable judgments about an individual based on their group membership. And if we just got that to sink in a little and get people to work and realize that, wow, there really is a lot of variability within these groups, and that may be all it would take to start breaking it down. But you're talking about an old program. It's been successful for like 70,000 years. You know, when you look at the 20th century, it was like the bloodiest century in human history, because it was able to activate this old program and get us thinking in ways of groups, in group and out group. And you know, you mix that old program with technology, and it becomes extremely dangerous. And so everyone's sort of waiting to see what's going to happen. I if you heard about this thing, maybe it was James Lindsay was talking about the, you know, the white pill or the black pill.
Right.
Yeah, and so you know, everyone's sort of like, it's such a complex system. It's very hard to predict very complex systems like this. So we're all sort of just waiting. And well, some of us are optimistic and think maybe we'll have these insights that, you know, race itself as a construction and the way we're defining it, and we'll have these insights that every time we solve a problem, we just find another problem, because that's what the mind will do endlessly. And then we shift, like you said, in your example, we've got two worlds. One is a world where we complain and we're a victim and we're miserable. And the other reality is we're incredibly grateful for this amazing adventure of being a conscious being on a planet at a time that's unprecedented in all kinds of really cool stuff that we could be incredibly grateful for. And all of a sudden we get really happy and we feel satisfied. And so those two worlds, as you described them, I mean, it is a choice that we make. And some people have just such a habit. You know, that's the thing about humans too. We're real susceptible to habit. So we complain, we feel miserable, but we're used to it. And so it takes a lot of conscious effort, like breaking any habit. You know, some people do. They put the cigarettes down, they never smoke again. But for other people, they struggle with it. And as I talk about in my mindfulness class, you know, sometimes we're so unhappy that we feel so comfortable being unhappy that we're actually, in a weird way, happy when we're unhappy.
Yeah.
And then and then we get this, feelings of enlightenment, not enlightenment, like, might think in a technical sense, but we feel like, kind of wonderful. We feel a little bit of joy because we start feeling grateful, but then we feel uncomfortable with feeling grateful because now all of a sudden, we feel like, oh, what's this? Am I privileged? Because privilege became a bad thing. It used to be something that you were grateful for and pondered on, and it was the origins of a lot of positive feelings. Now all of a sudden, if I have a certain amount of things and I live in a certain time, then all of a sudden, well, things that I didn't even choose, but I'm still grateful for them, but I didn't choose any of it. And then suddenly you kind of feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't feel so good about all this. So, but I do really think, the crossroads, taking the the white pill, the black pill, feeling some optimism. I mean, we really don't know where this is going to go. And of course, as someone who's got, one lawsuit that took place from 2014 to 2017, and then a second lawsuit that I'm currently in. So I'm kind of living it right at the front lines, you might say, at a university where you could say, okay, what's Niebauer doing that's so radical? Why is he this radical conservative? I mean, he writes books on spirituality. He writes books on, neuroscience and Buddhism. He's trying to transcend this idea of a self and get people to feel a little bit more grateful. Okay, well, that, what's so like radically conservative? Am I so far in the right now? And so it's very confusing for me to because I think things have shifted so far that, I actually call this the Borg theory of conformity. And I know a lot of people aren't familiar with the Borg. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I always, and I have to explain this to my students because they're like, they have no clue because it was 90s. But the Borg was this machine. It was half machine, half humans, and it was, they flew around in space in the cube, which I thought was interesting because, nature is filled with wiggles, and yet the mind always tries to square off things and create edges and stuff and flatten out the messiness of nature. So they represent a technology in its kind of most advanced form because they were able to, connect the organic to the computers. But the most amazing thing that they predicted in the 90s is that the Borg flew around space and it had one mission: destroy individuality. I mean, that was the mission of the Borg. They would just take up species and they would steal their technology. But the most important thing they would steal is their uniqueness as an individual and anything that was different. So it was like this, species that was, they would even say, resistance is futile. You're going to basically join us in becoming this one collective mindset. So it really, to me, if you haven't seen it before, I would suggest to people just watch a couple things. Even short YouTube clips. Just type in Borg and Star Trek, and you'll see how I think it was a almost prophetic insight into where we were going in terms of this kind of mass group, this mindset that would just kind of steamroll over things and be like, if we even have a hint that you're not conforming, then you're gone. And then of course that was in some ways a really short version of the last century, and of course it resulted in some estimates are up to 100 million deaths. It's I think we have to be pretty careful to see, how we're going to deal with this for this century.
Yeah, which can potentially be far worse, because we haven't learned anything, and history rhymes because basically human nature persists. That's the reason of it. But the difference right now is that we also have the technological tool to make that Borg structure or a hive mind reality into an actual reality. First through media and social media, and eventually through genetic engineering. And, we are at the very, very vital and extremely important point in history that I do believe that we either going to evolve into a post-human species, or we just end up annihilating ourselves, basically. This is not a place we can stay much longer. I want to talk more about this, but I think we laid the ground for about 45 minutes for you to talk a little in depth about the cases that you're dealing with, your lawsuits. You mentioned that you sent me links to some articles from 2014, Niebauer versus Slippery Rock University, and there's another one. This is from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Psychology professor at Slippery Rock University claims gender discrimination. All right, Chris, let's get to where these problems are coming from. You mentioned that they started in 2014. You're involved in the second lawsuit, and let's hear whatever there is to hear about it and how it all begun. How is it going, and where do you think it's headed?
Well, again, I transitioned from the old world to the new world, and again, that happened sometime around 2014. But I started off my career late 90s, and academia was really a place that was pretty minimum in politics. You could walk around and you could actually say who you voted for, and people might joke about it. Maybe someone came across as being on the right, and if you look at the numbers back then, it was always in balance, but it was something like 2 liberals for every 1 conservative. And so the numbers, they were always in balance, but there was enough of diversity there that it wasn't really a hive mind, and it wasn't really something coherent, something that, like you said, it all became more real with the internet and with that kind of instantaneous communication that we have now. That hive mind has become much more externalized and almost a reality to it. So I was in a department that did have a male chairperson. He died from cancer, and then that's kind of when everything changed. So he was out of the scene, and that's when I remember everything just sort of turned. It seemed to me that the main mission was get him out.
This is why
it was all female. This was about 2014.
Okay.
Now, it was maybe earlier than that. It was 2012 to 2013. And because I found myself being removed from every committee. I was getting really horrible reviews. I was getting complaints because certain things I would do at meetings, like supposedly I slammed my fist down on a desk one time at a meeting. I'm like, I don't think I've ever slammed my fist down ever on anything. So all these complaints started coming up, and like I said, I was just so excluded. The message was so clear, but I was trying to figure out, like, what did I do? And it's true that I did speak up a few times, and I did have a different opinion. But at the time, I thought, well, different opinions are just that. They don't mean hate. They don't mean, they're just different opinions. And so there was a time when they wanted to hire, and a lot of these problems started when they were doing new hires. So they wanted to hire someone, and I found a really qualified male applicant, and I was an advocate for him. And they went with a far less qualified, and it wasn't just a little far less. It was like, order of magnitude less than this other individual. And I really fought for the guy, not because he's a guy. I just fought because he was better at the job. He had more experience, far more experience. And then the person that they hired had no formal experience, but tons of political activism. And that's when I started kind of picking up on this transformation where departments went from being ordinary places of discourse to the hive mind starting to form. And the politics were more important than the scholarship. And that was a really, I don't think I really caught on to that until maybe I was in the middle of the lawsuit, where it started to hit me of, okay, this is what's happening. It's not just my university, it's actually happening in a lot of, that's when I started hearing stories from other places. Then, so the university now it's an all-female, all-white department in psychology, and in terms of full-time faculty. And the remarkable thing about this is that we've also just brought in a new position, the infamous diversity, inclusion, and equity department. So we now have a department that does that. And to me, I'm like, well, okay, that sounds noble, diversity, except the equity thing seems to be a little bit more difficult to
And I'm sorry,
understand exactly.
It's diversity, equity, and inclusion. It should be diversity, inclusion, and equity, because then it would write as DI. Now it's DEI. DI is way closer to what is going on with this concept than the other thing. Please continue. Sorry.
Oh, I had the same insight. I thought, because I kept putting the letters together. But, well, actually, if you switch these around a little bit, it's actually die, which is pretty much what it felt like they wanted me to do.
All right.
But it really got a little intense in terms of. In fact, it even got so bad that I had filed the federal lawsuit, and then I was kicked out of the department, and that was really remarkable to think that I could get kicked out of the department. I thought a lawsuit would keep you. They would watch themselves for retaliation. They wouldn't want to do something so overt as to retaliate. So they kicked me out, and then it took a lot of work to get my lawyer and reminding them what they just did, and then they sort of took it back and said, we didn't really do that. And but then it was about 2017, and we were doing a lot of settlement talks. And I don't think I still, it's been such a slow process for me to really put together what's going on that I still, and maybe I trivialized it because it was just too overwhelming. It's particularly in 2017, I was the only voice that I knew of that was dealing with this. I felt really isolated, really alone, zero support. And most of the stuff I got was like, look, and you started seeing these hints like, well, you're just a privileged white male. So, don't cry about it when some of your privileges get taken away. And so it was that sins of the father mentality that was like, I have to pay the bill because supposedly my people who had the same skin color and gender as me did this horrible stuff according to you, but I'm left paying the bill. And that mentality seemed absolutely unethical, and it seemed very primitive. It seemed like the way we would have, again, maybe thought, thousands of years ago. And so it was just, it was shocking that this was happening, that it could be so absolutely simplistic. But it all seemed, it was all, every time I would say, well, let me challenge this a little bit, let me see if maybe that's really on track. Every time I would challenge it, I just kept finding more and more evidence to support this. Like, okay, well, what about, and I've asked my university several times, well, what did I do? Just tell me. Because I've literally been guilty of this for so many years now, of something worthy of being kicked out of departments, because I've been kicked out of 2 now. But anyway, to get back to the settlement, it was a little overwhelming at the time, and they offered me a pretty good deal. They said, look, we'll let you go off and you can do your own department in cognitive science. You can kind of do whatever you want to do. And to be honest, that felt very enticing. I was very excited about that. So I said, okay, we'll do this. So I was in another department, and I got to develop a cognitive science concentration. So it's not like a major or anything. It's just like this, kind of small little thing that some people might be interested in. And I felt pretty comfortable with it. And I developed 6 new courses, and everything was going really well. In fact, I had students filling up the classes. They really liked it because I offered classes on consciousness and left-right brain and artificial intelligence and things that the university hadn't even thought of offering before. And so the classes were filling up. Everything's going okay. Okay, so round 2. And so I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to tell it like as I absolutely remember it. And it's one of these, it's such a powerful story, I think, because it gets at exactly what's wrong with the universities now. So I was in this department, it's called Interdisciplinary Programs, and it was a good place for me to be because they were all social scientists, anthropology, sociology, and so it was a place for me to do something that was eclectic, like cognitive science. And so I walk into our spring meeting, and I was about 45 minutes late because my daughter had a medical, she had impacted wisdom tooth, so I had to run her up and get her fixed before the meeting. So anyway, I run in, I'm just 45, the meeting lasts all day, so 45 minutes late isn't, it's like a, morning to late afternoon, 4 o'clock or something meeting. So I didn't think that's such a big deal. And I walk into the room. I remember we're a social science department, Department of Interdisciplinary Programs. So the whole thing is based around social science. I walk in and there's a huge thing on the board, and it says the Department of Cultural Diversity, the Department of Cultural Studies and Diversity. Big, Department of Culture. I'm like, okay, that's a little strange. Mission statement: diversity, inclusion, equity. I'm like, okay, well, that's weird too, because where did that come from? I was soon told that they had, in my absence, redefined themselves, which they're not allowed to do. As a department, they redefined themselves as a new department. They're no longer a social science department. They are now a department of cultural diversity, cultural studies and diversity. Okay, and their mission statement isn't social science any longer. The mission statement is the inclusion, diversity, and equity. And I was a little confused, and I thought, well, this is really strange. And they said, well, where does cognitive science fit in this? And it didn't take me too long to figure. I'm like, it doesn't fit in at all.
It doesn't. Yeah.
Cognitive science is it's a scientific discipline. It has nothing to do with political activism. And they said, well, you need to leave. You're no longer part of the department. And at the time, the dean was present, and that was it. It was like, you're gone. And so the irony of that is we're at a time where we get these new departments of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And of course, the first thing I did when I went back to my office is I wrote the president of the university, I wrote the provost, I wrote HR, I wrote the diversity office. I just sat and wrote a letter just explaining what just happened to me. It's not even permissible within our own guidelines. We're not allowed to just make up a new program out of any. It's like, imagine going into biology one day and they don't like some biologists because they think that they're on this political side.
No, I give you a better example that is more sensible for everybody. This is exactly what happened in Seattle when a bunch of these people went and they created autonomous zone. And they said, this is our territory now. It's not Seattle. It's not even the U.S. This is a territory that is we just built it here, and there are people still living there. There are still shops. And when they asked the mayor of Seattle, hey, what is up with what's going on with all these people? She said, we're probably going to have a summer of love. That was her explanation. Also coming from the same political ideology and political perspective. So it sounds like exact same thing happened in the academic setup.
It was just a smaller scale of the exact same thing, because as I wrote all of these, again, I got a bunch of mixed responses. Sometimes they said, well, that's just the tough luck of your life. Just live with it. It is. And then they said other things like, well, they never really did, just complete denial. Like, no, they never did that. And it went back and forth. But the interesting thing is they never investigated it. They were never they did this thing that was it would be so against their philosophy. If you ask someone and put it in different terms, say something like, you've got a mostly male department and there's one female, or you could play the race issue with it, and then everyone just got together and just kicked this person out. It would have been, now that would have been absolutely unacceptable, and heads would have rolled. I mean, everything would have. But because I have a certain status as, color of my skin, my gender, for some reason this stuff comes together, and it's kind of like, well, it's just him, and that's that sins of the father again. Like, you're paying for this stuff, you had nothing to do with it, and they didn't do a single thing. They didn't investigate it. I was even told by the head of HR, I was explaining this at a meeting to her, and she just said, look, I don't care what happened in the past. The only thing I'm concerned about is what's happening right now. And the problem with that is, again, obviously, there's just something special about my unique setup that seems to give, the red light to these kind of behaviors. And one of the things I think we need to really work on is some I'm not a very consistent human being, but I really like, and yes, these are all maybe they're all social constructs. Countries are social constructs. But if we're really going to work together as a civilization with some kind of coherency, we have to have some kind of consistency. We can't just let some groups absolutely redefine reality and completely get away with it, and then other groups be powerless. I mean, that's the exact oppression that they're talking about. They're saying we get to construct reality. Your version of reality isn't valid, and I mean, it was a pretty intense experience. And then they just threw me into a department of one. So I went from being in an actual department with I think it was 8 or 9 people, and suddenly I'm like on this little island of misfit toys, like, but I'm all alone. It's like, well, we'll put you off in your own department. And so it's really, punishment after punishment. I'm
What did
just
they
thinking,
call
well,
that department? The Department of White Supremacy?
I really think, again, well, one of the problems I had too is that I was, there was a guy from the military who's a retired lieutenant colonel, and we got along pretty well because we both thought so much about teaching students how to think for themselves rather than what to think. And we just really thought that was important. And we kind of clicked, and he was very good. He was an excellent teacher. He had this ability to go in and really shake up people's reality systems, which I think is part of what education is about. Shake things up a little bit, get you thinking, and get you to understand how the mind works. So you can, that's the thing. Here's our gift. We'll teach you how the mind works. Then you can think about whatever you want and believe whatever you want. But we're not here to tell you what to believe and what to think. And so we connected up, and he was in that department with me, that interdisciplinary programs department. He was the leadership person, which fit in also nicely with all this. And they got rid of him he was on the chopping block way before I was. And so they had kicked him out first. And then they, depending on how you want to read it, they either fired him. They gave him, so classes started in 3 days. He didn't get a contract until 3 days before classes started. And so he had, by their own account, it should have been out months before by their own rules. But anyway, the short version is, it could have maybe my association with him. So that's the thing. Like, if we're gonna really improve society, me and you can talk. Now, if you go talk to some other person that I don't really care for, that shouldn't really affect our relationship. I mean, why do I care who you talk? Like, why can't we have a multiplicity and understand? Like, look, there's a lot of selves in us, and there's a lot of different sides to our personality, and it's a complex picture. And why does it have to be set up like, well, if you are friends with this person, then I can't be friends with you? And to me, I think we're seeing that break a little bit. I'm sure you've seen those conversations between like Ben Shapiro and Russell Brand and people who disagree with each other, but still we're learning to talk again. And we're learning that even if I disagree with you, that doesn't mean I hate you. It just means I disagree with you. And so I do see some hope. That's why I was saying I'm much more of a white pill person. In spite of all the stuff that's happened to me and spending 10 years in court and on my second lawsuit, and it's not, who knows how it's really going right now, but I feel extremely confident that, that this will turn in my favor, because you can't just do this. You can't, the school has no policy that says that they could have done this. It violated the lawsuit settlement that said, look, we're going to put you here. So they had no power to just kick me out that one day. So that's really a huge percent of what the lawsuit is about. Because if we really want to improve, it's very difficult to create a bureaucracy around treating other people nice. It's very difficult to say, well, because some freedom is just having that ability to be a jerk some days. And so, but you can see us, we're really trying to do that. We're trying to I think political incorrectness, political correctness movement, that was kind of the beginning of this bureaucracy around how we treat other people. Now, the thing is, the irony of all that is it's really not such a bad thing to treat other people in a decent way, but I don't think we can create it into a bureaucracy. We can't have rules. You must be nice to this person. And if we are, and I guess the reason I'm saying that is because, did you ever hear, there's a wonderful saying from the East, and Alan Watts used to always say it. He said, when the wrong person uses the right means work in the wrong way.
Right.
And so what's happening here is it's a noble, maybe virtuous idea, but in the wrong hands, what ends up happening is we create a whole set of like niceties for some people, but then other people can, burn at the stake, and like we're okay with that. And so, but I'm optimistic, but I haven't yet heard one person, Jonathan Haidt, Jordan Peterson, and even James Lindsay. I haven't listened to everything that he has done, but I haven't really heard the smoking gun of, okay, well, here's how we fix it. Have you come across anyone with like?
It's the matter of what that it is. What are we fixing? Because I think this is yes, it's revealing what some people think, because this is not like a bunch of people at the top of the hierarchy of bureaucracy who are pushing this forward. They're also supported by tens of millions of people who, they're the same people who would vote for further restrictions, for vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, just basically some kind of a, supreme authority. Because most of these people are atheists, they have replaced that supreme authority with the government. And government now has merged with corporate monopolies. Big tech monopolies is more obvious than others. So the fix from my perspective, because I see the solution as access and choice, and I see the trend of technological evolution towards more access and more choice. This obviously is disrupting some of our own structures, including the society, including institutions. But then we have to make the choice between whether or not these structures that we have built, and they've worked for as long as they have, are we really insistent on keeping these structures intact, even though they've been rotted to the core? Or we just move on to whatever comes next, and we're building the alternative at the same time. So the solution is building, because the problem is canceling. And it's being driven from centralized points of authority, centralized structures of authority, which have emerged in the form of monopolies. Government is a monopoly. Academia is a monopoly. So even the right questions are not being asked, because the questions need to be asked that pursue the aim and the objective of people who are running these monopolies. If you're running a university and somebody comes and say, hey, I want to talk about race and intelligence, you're not going to do that, because people who are supporting you and funding you are not okay with that. But that is probably one of the most important topics that we do need to talk about, because it's affecting everything else, especially now that we're building artificial intelligence. You know what I'm saying? So the solution is not a utopian solution. The solution is allowing individuals to experience themselves in a decentral kind of a manner, which is the equivalent of being able to go to different shopping stores and buy whatever you want, and then form tribes in a voluntary kind of a way. That, we see the evidence of that online and in virtual kind of environments far more than this world, because access and choice is limited in this world by design. But digitally, like World of Warcraft, that was a society of people who came together around this video game. They all coming from different backgrounds. None of that mattered. You came together to achieve certain kind of objective within that game. And then you went on and joined your other tribes, who could be, your classmates or family. So you didn't have one specific kind of a tribe. You had different tribes for different objectives. And so I think this is where we are headed. I'm also judging based on developments that are happening technologically. We're moving from Web 2, which is what we have now, to Web 3, which is serverless, decentralized. Nobody owns the data. Everybody who's in the network owns the network, but nobody really owns it. It's decentralized. And they're serverless. So you don't have like Twitter They were like, oh, you're talking in the way that we don't like you to talk about. We're just going to silence you. We're going to remove you. But at the same time, there are a lot of push. I don't know if you saw a so-called whistleblower emerge from Facebook saying that Facebook allowing people to say whatever they want for profit. And the solution that she provided is for government to have more basically supervision, to more control over the big tech. That everybody calling nonsense on that. And she's an instrument of furthering this monopoly, basically merging it with the government. So I think that's where we are, that people have more access and more choices because of our tools that have advanced in a way that, you know, the president of the United States probably wouldn't even have access to this level of technology 20 years ago. And people who are invested in those monopolies and in those centralized or centrally determined objectives, they're throwing everything they can at it because they're losing control.
Yeah, actually, if I had some input with that, it's similar in some ways, because one of the ways I see out of this is just practicing really deeply into spirituality, because the whole trip of most spiritual traditions is that, particularly in the East, is that you're just not this body. And so it's that recognition, like, race is really trivial. My gender is really trivial. And yet we've escalated these to such self-defining qualities that, you know, there's this whole thing where kids try to figure out what their gender is. And yet, and at the same time, the spiritual movement is saying, your gender is really not who you are. So really, why even think about it? It's not who you are.
I think, you know, actually, if I may say this, because we obviously been talking about this for a while, just you and me, and we've been thinking about this much, much longer. And I think now, because there is a equivalent in the digital world of everything that is happening here, it's very important to make this distinction that, yes, you're not your body, but at the same time, you need your body to survive in this structure that is a society that is built by humans who are not necessarily smarter than you are. So I think more than focusing on the spiritual side, it's more profound to recognize the difference between who you are in this body and in this form and who you really are objectively, right? And when you see that difference, then your race and your culture wouldn't make that much of a difference compared to your avatar that you use in some video games, for example. This is how you want to represent yourself in the digital world. This is how you represent it because of the game of evolution in this world. Yet none of it is objectively real. These are constructs. Objectively, what is real, that's for you to figure out on your own. There can't be any kind of an objective directive for that either. So it becomes a game.
Well, yeah, so the body, you're stuck with it. And so, you know, it's not this kind of thing like just, you know, stop working out or anything. But the idea is that it's just not central to your identity.
Yeah.
And then it's that neti movement where you're just not this, not that. So you say, well, I'm not really my age. I'm not really my gender. I'm not really this name. I'm not really. And then you strip all that away, and then you get back down to this real mystery that's impossible to put into words, but it's far more who you are. And in that way, so again, and it sounds contradictory in some ways, but you move away from this. It's actually what Jung called the quest of the hero. The quest of the hero is to be embedded in this massive collective and to venture out individually and explore your own path. I love that one place in the Legends of King Arthur, where the Knights of the Round Table, when they entered the dark forest, they had to enter at their own place. They couldn't go where there was a path. And so that's the thing. It's like we're all having this adventure of figuring out our own identity, and it seems like it's moving from the collective identity that culture tells us, and they just tell us this. And, well, here's who you are, to the adventure of stripping all that away and seeing what's left. And in some cases, you have these transcendent experiences. And this is where these, you know, like the Nisargadatta or, you know, Ramana Maharshi and these like really classic spiritual teachers, I mean, their whole practice centered around removing illusion and getting at what is true. And there's just certain things that, culture, it's so pervasive. Conformity is so pervasive. We don't even realize how often we think, well, I'm thinking for myself. But you don't realize that your thoughts aren't even your own either. You didn't invent the language. You didn't invent half the things that you're thinking about. Would you still think of the same thing if you were born 1,000 years ago on the other end of the globe? And what we need to, get to the original, okay, what's the common, what am I beyond all these illusory social roles? And then you come to some very peaceful places, and it's very hard to be combative when you get into that state. And so, but that's, maybe just a small part of it. I think like anything, it's a complex problem. It's not going to be one easy. There's never one, switch to flick when it comes to complex problems. It's going to be, all kinds of things that have to come together. But the Stoics had a great saying, the obstacle is the way. And so what I do is I look at all these obstacles and I say, well, this is the way. And so much of what I've dealt with has given me deeper insights on how to deal with this stuff, deeper, more interesting tricks on how to deal with, being kicked out over and over and dealing with bureaucracy. And you see this. It's a funny thing where cancel culture backfires. They get rid of these people, and then they end up becoming famous. They're doing podcasts now. They're doing book deals, and so or even like what happened with Dave Chappelle. They say, well, we're going to cancel, and then it really doesn't seem to work. There's something about that path of individuation. Again, so I think our species, we had to have most of us be conformists, but we also needed some percentage of us that were individuals. I mean, how do you grow? How do you come up with something new unless someone breaks the mold? And so I think we've got these people on the hero's journey, and they're out there being individuals. They're resisting the Borg mentality. And the funny thing about them is, the collective thinks that they've destroyed them, but they've empowered them, and suddenly they're having book deals, and they don't even have like real jobs anymore. They just real in the sense like 9 to 5 kind of thing, and they're just enjoying what they're doing, going on podcasts and creating discussions about what happened to them. I mean, would Jordan Peterson really be where he's at if the whole pronoun debate didn't kind of launch him into fame? I mean, on the one hand, he's a smart guy, but he got thrown into the limelight because of a particular debate that wanted to cast him out, but they never were able to do it. They made him more powerful than he could have ever been as an ordinary university professor if that debate had never taken place.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson is a perfect example, obviously, for him standing up in academia, but also they cut his budget. I was in Toronto at a time when all of this was happening, and leftists were out of control back then in Canada. I think now they pretty much taken over all the institutions in that country in the kind of a very non-competitive kind of way. But when they cut Jordan Peterson's budget, they crowdsourced and they raised I think something like 10 times the amount that he would have gotten. So that was like a flicker, and I think it was like 2017, something like that. That, hey, you don't really need institutions, this whole connectivity globally, because it would be very silly to say that only Canadians are learning from Jordan Peterson, or only English-speaking people are learning from, for example, Jordan Peterson. There are people all around the world, and you got like a couple of million people each chip in like $2. All of a sudden he's making tens of millions of dollars, which, as you said, making him more powerful. The other thing is this concept of good and bad, right and wrong. Again, objectively, yes, they don't exist. But when you're on a boat and somebody start putting a hole in that boat, because there is a context, you understand what is good and what is bad in a very obvious kind of way, right? Now, absolutely. If your boat end up sinking, you might find some kind of a treasure that's been buried, under, wrecks of a ship under the ocean and all that. Yes, that's a possibility, but also it's a suggestion that there is no such a thing as absolute good and bad. I was telling someone else very unhappy about lockdowns during COVID and stuff. I'm very activist against critical race theory. So I was telling her, hey, without lockdowns, most parents wouldn't have found out what is being taught at public school in K to 12 education system, including a lot of this critical race theory. And she said, yeah, you're right. I'm like, well, so lockdowns, were they good and bad? In the objective sense, you cannot say whether they were good and bad, because if they end up leading to some kind of a actual enlightenment as a result of all of this, well, they were all good, but they were also bad because a lot of people got harmed by them. So I think this is an important thing that people begin to understand, that, hey, I can be, let's say, a conservative Jesus believer, but when someone like Dave Rubin, who's coming from the left and talking common sense, I can rely on some of his perspective and some of his realizations in order to build myself that raft that Buddha talks about. You need a raft to cross the river, but you're doing that on your own eventually. There is no collective salvation ultimately. It is being promised, but it's poisonous, I think.
And that's why we're all on this. And again, it's an irony to talk about the self, the ego as an illusion, but then at the same time say, look, we're all on this adventure in a very individualistic way. Well, look, the world's filled with interesting contradictions. I think this is just another one of them, because like I said, it was that's that whole hero's adventure. But I was going to go somewhere else with that, and then I sort of got distracted. But maybe it'll come back to me in a second.
Yeah, voluntary tribalism. We come together for a lot of different things, and we have great times doing that. At the dinner party, we're a tribe. We gather around because of food and good conversation, and then we go to music festival. We're a new tribe with a bunch of other people. The problem is, like in my case, you're born into a religion called Islam, and then they tell you all throughout your school that if you leave this religion, it's punishable by death. So you might as well just submit and do all these other things that we're asking you to do, which is very aligned with where these leftists Marxists are coming from. And, interestingly enough, before the Iranian Revolution, Marxists and Islamists, they had made an alliance against the Shah of Iran, who they consider to be puppet of United States. So totalitarians are always aligned in this pursuit of forced collectivism, forced tribalism, based on some, utopian ideal that is good for the collective. And, the counter to that is voluntary tribalism, because I don't think we can get rid of tribalism. Tribalism has been very, very effective and useful. It still is. But so is individuality. This ability to be able to opt in and opt out at any given time for any given reason, based on whatever kind of objective that you individually have, that you can find other people share that objective with you, and when you're done with that objective, you go and find your own way.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I would probably, like, from my view, we're talking about the same thing, just using different words. I'd probably say like playful tribalism versus serious tribalism. And so when you're playful with it, then you switch modes, and suddenly I'm a musician talking to musicians, and that's my tribe. And then maybe you switch, and then within a fraction of a second, you're doing so. But it's like you said, I love that idea, like, voluntary tribalism, because then that puts the individual and to break out of that collective. What I was going to mention is, Carrie Smith? She does the podcast, I think, Unsafe Spaces.
Oh yeah, I heard the name. Yes, and the podcast. Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple things I would suggest if you're watching this, that because she was very much into the cult, and she describes it as a cult, like the left is cult. She adopted this viewpoint, like everything is racist, everything is sexist, and just like confirmation bias, she just found it, of course, because that's the way it works. And so I was talking to her, just texting or something, and I said, what could I have said to you that would have broken you out of that mindset? How could I have woken you up from being woke? She was like, that's a great question. And I think she pondered on it. She never got back to me on it, because I think it's like, it's not up to me. Like it's such an individual process that like she was on her own. It was her who woke up from it. She was the one who suddenly realized that she didn't want to be part of the collective anymore, and she wanted some choice. And actually, she even kind of describes like, this idea, like now she has tribes and stuff, but they very voluntary, and you're not committed. You're not signing your life away to anyone. So you can quit a tribe at any time. And it's not a lifelong, and there's no reason why you can't be part of inconsistent tribes. And so maybe, A and B would never get along, but you have no problem being part of A and B.
Yeah.
And so, and that's a flexibility. And I think that's really important. I would also, when I was, just so many things that happened in the last 100 years, we so quickly forget. And I'm sure you're familiar with Jim Jones and Jonestown and the whole cult and the capacity of them to drink the Kool-Aid, which I really don't like that expression, because I don't know if you're familiar with the details, but he was literally too cheap to buy Kool-Aid. He bought Flavor Aid, which just seems to be like, look, like everyone's like you're doing this massive act of insanity, and yet somehow you're worried about the budget. It just shows the complexity and inconsistencies in how disturbed his thinking was. But not everyone. One of the things that was super important about the documentary, even though it was horrific and it was almost 1,000 people that died, not everyone did. Like there. So we can always look with these massive, conformity, and we find people who found themselves. There was an older woman, I think, who hid under a bed and survived Jonestown. So I think that's really hopeful, and I guess that's why I'm hopeful about this. I think we're going to find we're going to find the importance of, I just like the way you put that. I think we're going to find the importance of having a voluntary tribe, to be able to pick and choose what tribes we are. And that really satisfies the old program. It gives it something to do. It satisfies its needs, but it doesn't create, the massive collective of one single tribe that's, kind of, like I said, steamrolling over everyone else. And that's when, that's the real tragedies of the 20th century, was that one tribe got so big and it got so massive, and it was capable of inflicting so much damage that we don't want to have any one tribe get that big again. I mean, we're always, going around our ancestors, groups of 50 to 100 max. We're not used to these kind of, millions of people being communist, or millions of people being any one tribe. I mean, that's just something that our programming isn't adapted to deal with. So I do think there's hope, but I think it lies in that individuality and finding your own path, which is always difficult to do. But who was it? The mythologist Joseph Campbell said, "Follow your bliss." That's a great pointer to finding your own path, because some of these paths are just dreadful. I think the biggest thing I've noticed over the last 10 years, I used to go into a classroom, and I'm not much of a comedian, but as a professor, I do my best, and I'll do weird jokes and stuff. And I used to get a classroom going. I mean, we're just to have fun, and it was all light and playful. And I think the biggest thing I've noticed over the last 10 years is I walk into a classroom that like the energy is just, you can feel it. It's different. It's dreadful. It's like, what can we find that's wrong with everything? And I think we've done a real disservice to the students, because that's a recipe for depression. It's a recipe for anxiety, and we shouldn't really be doing that to them. I'm surprised there isn't some kind of class action lawsuit where millions of students all get together and realize that what they bought in their education at the university was not what was sold to them.
Yeah.
And just do a massive class action lawsuit and say, we want our money back, because you said you were going to, you said you were going to teach psychology, and, I came out a Marxist. So, right. I mean, so and that may happen. I've kind of been waiting around, and I'm just surprised it hasn't already.
Well, I think we're getting to something similar to that, because one of the reasons that this Virginia election went the way it did was because the Democrat McAuliffe, he said parents shouldn't tell school what to teach to their children. And that was the point that everything began to shift, because people are like, and this is not something that is limited to that race. This is a motto of that movement. Washington Post came out a couple of days after that saying parents claim they have the right to shape their kids' school curriculum. They don't. I'm like, what? So for a lot of people, I think, because, the result in Virginia couldn't have happened only with Republican votes. They must have included some Democrats and many independents going and voting for this Republican governor, because there are more. It's like by million. I think that there's a difference between registered Democrats in Virginia. But people, when it gets to their pockets and it gets to their children, it must be some kind of a organic evolutionary thing that you forget everything else, and this is the most important thing. And that is exactly why the left is targeting your money and your children, because if you don't have money, you don't have choice. If you're giving up your children at age 3 or 4 that these people are pushing for, then there isn't that far of a difference from there to Jonestown, which I think it's also interesting to mention. Jonestown, as far as I know, they're blaming the dude, Jim Jones, for all of it from the beginning to the end. But apparently, towards the end, he was so drugged up and messed up that he wasn't really in charge of things. So there were a lot of women within that group that carry on with all the operation and all the ideas and all those things. Which, again, there are leaders who are pushing this kind of thing, but there are millions of people who are empowering it. When they're giving you a snitch line to snitch on your neighbor, for example, in Los Angeles, if they're having party, call the mayor's office so they shut down their electricity and their water, their hydro stuff. And a lot of people are doing it. And I totally believe it, because they used to do that in Iran all the time, just because they would look good and good students from the perspective of the government, from the perspective of the authority.
Yeah. Well, I think, like you said a little earlier, that we have a it's close to a saying we have in martial arts. We say everyone has a theory till they get punched in the face. And
exactly.
We've got all these political ideologies and stuff, but when it starts hitting the family, when it starts hitting hitting us and things that we really hold dear, I mean, then you see this with the parents. They stepped in and have been extremely vocal about critical race theory, and I think even if people are not familiar with the Jane Elliott studies, they know how susceptible kids are to being taught political philosophies, and particularly when the other side isn't being taught. I don't have any problem with any kind of political philosophy at the university, as long as both sides of the issue. And just to give you one other example, back when I was in psych, there was a bunch of students out, and they were had a booth, and they were advocating or not advocating, they were criticizing the gender pay gap. And, the whole 30 cents that women make, or 70 cents on the dollar that men make $1 for, or something like that. And I'm like, okay, everyone knows that wage gap debate. It's been around forever, like 30 years. And I said, okay, well, all that's fine. But what about the death gap? And they just looked at me and like, what do you mean, the death gap? I said, well, what about the homeless gap? And they're like, what are you even talking about? I'm like, well, you realize that men not only die sooner, but the suicide rate is astronomically higher among men than it is with women. The homelessness rate with men is. So I was just giving them the counter argument. That's all I was doing. It's like, okay, would you rather die soon or make a little bit more money? And that's assuming that the gender pay gap was valid to begin with. But that's the point of debate. And they never heard the idea, so they were able to reject it. The first time they heard it is when I told it to them.
Yeah.
They never even heard of the death gap. I'm like, how could you go through a gender studies class and come out thinking that you want to be an advocate for social change? Well, how can you be an advocate for social change when you're hearing one side of the story?
Yeah.
What makes you think, why are you going to be able to change things when you've only heard part of the debate? It amazes me. There's a wonderful line from Robert. I don't know if we're getting close to the end. I like to leave it at an optimistic place, but this is a little bit dark. But I think it's actually a good it has a positive ending to it. And one of Robert Oppenheimer's, famous, nukes and all this stuff, but one of my favorite quotes of his, he said, "Look, it's absolutely obvious the world is going to hell. The only chance we have of ever stopping this is to stop trying to stop it." And it was such a great thing that Alan Watts used to talk about all the time, and that he would say, and that's why Alan Watts, that's why he's coming back into popularity, because he said, look, all these self-helpers, and they're just troublemakers.
Yeah.
They're people with egos, and they think they know what they're doing, but why? It's a terribly egotistical thing. If you want to go out and change the world, first sit back and think why you think you have the wisdom to change it in the right direction. And he even quoted Confucius, which I've never found the original quote on this, so fact check that, I don't know. But he was quoting Confucius, and he said, and he was translating it, and he said, and I'm just trying to give a feel for this, is just back in the 60s he was talking about this. But he said the goody-goodies are the troublemakers of the world. And he was trying to point out that, almost in this Jungian sense, that if I have a bright persona, I end up having a very dark shadow. So all these advocates for, let's all make the world a better place, there's such a long history of those being the real troublemakers that, I think we need to be really careful who's stepping up saying, just trust me on this. I'll change the world, and I've got a plan, and just kind of close your eyes and just hope it all works out. And I just think we have to be, the social activism movement has to pause for a little bit, do some self-reflection, and ask a really simple question, like, what makes me think I've got the answers? These are complex problems, and it's so rare for us to have such nice, clear insights into even simple things in our own life, let alone thinking like, look, I can fix racism by introducing critical race theory. Do you know that? I mean, how do you? I mean, what makes you so absolutely? Because again, if you're not going to consider the other side of the debate and say, well, okay, well, maybe critical race theory is going to make us actually more racist. If you don't even consider that, then why are you in charge? Why did you step up and start telling people what to do? And so,
and this is the reason that they don't want to train thinkers; they want to train activists. And they want to get to your children as soon as they can, so that will become the de facto default state of the world. It's just so obvious. It's just that more people seem to be waking up to it, because, when you go in United States to buy something and you can't find it on the shelf, and you see that people who run this country are telling you, actually, the problem is that you're expecting too much. So lower your expectation. Then, along with your kid coming home and ask you, am I evil because I'm white? This is just not a good combination to happen to anybody, especially people who've been living here. And, Americans you guys are like super nice and super generous, but unbelievably majority of Americans ignorant of the potential and capacity of evil. That how much worse this whole thing can get if you just allow these people who are nothing but totalitarians. That's what they are. They're totalitarians. They don't want any argument. They want submission, and they're using ethics and morality. And we are in this place, for better or worse, as a result of enlightenment, that gotten rid of that centralized supreme authority in the form of God as interpreted by religions, that I don't apply to that, but at the same time I don't consider myself being an atheist. I think that concept of the divinity has been hijacked by other totalitarians who are priests and bishops and all those people. And once you got rid of that centralized authority, it brought with it a lot of good, but at the same time it replaced academia and professors with churches and priests. And that's where we are, and it cannot go on any longer, because this idea of equity, at some point it will get to genetics. And they were like, oh, actually, we know that we're unequal at the genetic level, so we have all the rights to alter the genetic of all the white babies to be to create. This is not science fiction. This can happen within the next 5 to 10 years if we don't stop this insanity where it's headed. But I fortunately, I see that more people are waking up. Yet this does not mean that everything is going to be great, because this can also lead to somewhere even darker than where we are right now. We just don't know.
No, you reminded me of another lecture that Alan Watts had, where it was just brilliant. He said, and it would have fit so well in terms of like the real power of diversity, because he was on a genetics committee and they were asking, like, what kind of variables should we consider? And he brought up a really important point to begin with. He said, look, how do us who are genetically inferior even make a decision about what genetic superiority even is? And we're not in that kind of position. But then he gave, I think, some of the best advice. He said, whatever you do genetically, make sure you have a vast diversity, because you never know what we're going to deal with. And so, some of the activists might say, well, hey, we can get rid of toxic masculinity, and we can go in and we can create males that are not completely non-aggressive. And you say, well, that's a great idea. And then the aliens attack. And then you're kind of like, where are those, men are just going to go out and not even care, just fight like heroes and just, and they're gone because we think we can predict the future. And it's very difficult. So I like that idea. Whatever we do genetically, let's not, because we may need introverts, and we may need extroverts, and we may need, for all we know, we may need, drunken, people. We might think, well, if we could just get rid of these, certain types, the world would be a better place. And you don't realize how complex systems are balanced out, and you can't just take one little thread and pull on it and not affect the whole thing. And so those are dangerous systems to mess with. I hope we don't, because I don't think we have the wisdom to deal with that type of complexity.
Yeah, we don't know where we were. We don't know where we are. We don't know where we're going, and neither does anyone else.
No. That's the wisdom. A lot of spiritual teachers say that wisdom begins with the I don't know mind. And I really like that, because that stops a lot of activism in their tracks, because they'll, so much, not all, but some activism starts off with this, like, I know. I have this moral certitude, and I know exactly, in the same way that people burned witches knowing that person was a witch, and the Inquisition, and we can go through so much of human history where people had absolute certainty. These people didn't stay awake at night regretting what they did. They went to sleep, absolutely confident that they were virtuous, and so we have a long human. But you're right about how easy it is to forget about the last century, and how it doesn't seem like we're really getting a very good education. And I'll ask students about some dictate something that happened, one of the great bloody wars, and no one knows anything about it. I mean, they can't even name people know about Hitler, and people and they could talk a little bit about Mao Zedong, or some of these other, Stalin even. I mean, they really don't know the stories of the number of people, and so many people died, and they don't even have accurate estimates. I mean, there's so many, in the millions, that it's very difficult to calculate. And that could be really important for us to digest, and because what it shows, I think, is that, this is like a very this program for violence and this program for conformity, and the conformity, the power of us to inflict pain on the outgroup in the name of being virtuous is actually remarkable. We have a long human history of doing this, and it might be time, and it could be, where we simply recognize the program for what it is, and maybe there's hope. I don't know.
I was gonna ask you to give a message to the world to end the podcast, but I think you already did. So I think this is a good place to end it. You said, "I hope." I don't know. Perfect.
I think it is. Hope is. There's one of my old favorite movies, Shawshank Redemption. He gives a little speech about hope is the best of things, and nothing good ever dies. And I think it's important. is we haven't had enough hope. I mean, there hasn't been that person who stood up and gave us a great speech to kind of act. Was we have hope programs too, and those hope programs got us through a lot of rough times. But we haven't had that person who got up and gave that speech that turned it on and just and revigorate, just kind of brought it back to life. So we felt hopeful again. Because Nietzsche, when he wrote. When Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning, he opens it, about all the concentration camps, and his survival and all the suffering. But he opens it up with a quote by Nietzsche, he said, if you have a why, you can deal with any how. And, it's real close, that purpose, the meaning, the hope, those things could get us through this, it's possible.